Hi everyone, my name is Gabi and I'm an assistant professor of design and design studies at York University here in Toronto. Thanks to Jackie and the ILC for having me here this afternoon to talk about a project which I started for my dissertation and continue to work on today. I take as my objects of inquiry the graphic pain scale, a critical category of technique and a core component of pain medicine, and thus a core component of the ways that pain came to be understood and communicated by medical professionals and by people in pain since the late 20th century. What I'd like to do today is briefly explain the history of each of these scales and suggest that by doing so, we might problematize their use as tools for information gathering. In fact, I ask, might they actually be barriers to understanding the patient in pain? I'll start here. I'm assuming some of you recognize this. It's the visual analog scale, and it's usually presented about 10 centimeters long, with the label no pain on the left and most pain on the right, or something like that, and between the two labels, a simple black line. This is the graphic rating scale, the grandfather of the visual analog scale. Notice how there are more than two bipolar labels, but it's still a smooth, unmarked line. And the reason this one reads very superior all the way on the left and dull all the way on the right is that it's from a form about the graphic rating report on workers. You see, the GRS was invented by the Scott Company engineers and consultants in industrial personnel of Philadelphia in 1921, what we call today a management consulting company, primarily concerned with the efficiency of workers. In fact, they were so concerned with the efficiency that they created a more efficient way to rate the efficiency of their workers. Here's another version from the same paper by Donald Patterson that introduced the scale in 1922, and you can see that executives get the good adjectives like inspiring and capable and forceful leader. I want you to look, however, at what we would call the metadata of the form today, the space for name, date, department, etc. Here's an enlarged version. And what's different about the lines here is that they're dotted, right? They're not smooth like the scales. Now, given that, let me show you this example from someone named Dr. Max Fried, who was a psychologist in the early part of the century. This is an excerpt from a form that he published on an article about evaluating students, and this was done about a year after Patterson's paper, so this is from 1923. And I kind of want you to consider what's different about this graphic rating scale. Firstly, it's not a smooth line. There are dots on it. In fact, there are 87 dots, so an odd number. And the question is, why are there dots here? Was it a printing decision? But in the same paper, there's a chart with smooth lines on it and a table with smooth lines. So maybe it is or maybe it's not a printing decision. Now, the paper was printed in The Lancet. Some of you may be familiar with The Lancet. It's been around for a long time. Here's one from 1827. And this is a linotype. Back in 1923, and really until the late 70s, The Lancet used one of these machines to lay out the text in their journal. Someone would sit and type at this keyboard here, and as they did, matrices of letters would be selected from the cartridge up above here. And these little metal molds, or the matrices, would be aligned in order of the characters being typed. Down here, molten lead is pushed through the molds once the typesetter reaches the end of the line, and once that lead cools, it can be arranged to print a page of type rather quickly. So rather than having to pick the individual characters that are pre-made in lead, you could just type on this keyboard and it would sort of create these sentence or line long molds. So for an article like Fried's 1923 piece, they'd probably lay out the form on the left on the linotype, and they would use dots or periods to draw the lines. Then they'd etch by hand these charts here, and they do that in a piece of copper. You can kind of see that the axes are handwritten, right? Anything that's vertical. And then they would lock it up, meaning they would sort of arrange it within the press. And then finally on the right here, they'd lock up a table like this using lining figures and lead rules. So they had special lines that were made of lead, though they were usually the entire length of the page. So why do these dots matter so much to me? Because relatively speaking, this article is cited a ton. It's even still cited today. Here's an article that has a publication date on it of May 2023, and you can see that it still cites Freed's article. So it's critical that we break down whether or not Freed meant to include a solid line or if it was a publishing limitation. And while we research that, we get to learn a little bit about publishing in the 1920s through the 1970s. In order to do this research, I've collected examples of published GRS and VAS visuals. Here are the ones I found with solid lines. And so one of the questions that I have as I do this research is what made these scales last nearly over 100 years at this point? To answer that, we're going to look at one of the earlier scale's inventors, that is Walter Dill Scott. At the time of Patterson's publication, Scott was president of Northwestern University, president of the American Psychological Association, had been founding director of the Bureau of Salesmanship at the Carnegie Institution of Technology, and was the 1917 recipient of the Distinguished Service Medal as a colonel in the U.S. Army for his work establishing a rating method for officers. He was, to be sure, one of the first in the United States to combine industrial management with the emerging field of applied psychology. Scott's background in psychology was rooted in his doctoral work with Wilhelm Wundt at the University of Leipzig at the turn of the century. Wundt, who is best known as the founder of experimental psychology, opened the first laboratory for psychological studies in 1879. And under Wundt, Scott wrote a dissertation that, through an historical exploration of human impulses, he uses the term Trieb, from 1755 to 1900, he argues that a Wundtian definition of instinct, quote, better than any other, summarizes the various historical treatments of the subject, while at the same time harmonizing with the modern psychological views, unquote. As Scott explains it, Wundt's approach to human impulse is, quote unquote, of a reflex mechanical nature. And that's worth unpacking further if we are to understand the implication of Scott's training in the development of the graphic rating scale. Scott goes on to quote Wundt, "These innate impulses, however, are, as we say, states of a particular striving or reluctance, in which an existing feeling of pleasure or pain causes bodily movements, the effect of which is directed to the intensification of the feeling of pleasure or to the elimination of the feeling of lack. Think about the movement of marking, how quickly one is expected to respond. Remember, the factory foreman stands at the top of the catwalk, watches his employees, judges them, and then moves on to the next one. The graphic rating scale, and eventually the visual analog scale, is an attempt by a researcher to trigger an impulse. It asks an evaluator to make a mark based on a feeling or observation. In his 1903 The Theory of Advertising, Scott spends an entire chapter explaining the power of suggestion and how advertisers take advantage of it to encourage or inspire a consumer to spend money. If, as Scott suggests, humans are easily inspired to act by simple advertising copy, then it follows that when seeking an impulsive and as such volitional response from an evaluator, then there must be as little suggestion as possible. In the same work, Scott offers his law of suggestion. He writes, "Every idea of a function tends to call that function into activity and will do so unless hindered by a competing idea or physical impediment. Ideas such as breaks in lines and graduation, then, must be eliminated from the scales in order to remove any suggestions. Enter then the visual analog scale, a descendant of the graphic rating scale stripped even more bare than those lines put forth by Patterson and others." And so we're back here. As the line was further stripped of its ornaments and graduations during its transformation into the visual analog, as opposed to digital, scale, the tool offered more possibilities to its users. No dots, notches, labels, or numerals offered any sort of guidance along the scale. When a patient marks it, they might feel a freedom, right? No need to quantify, no need to identify, just make a mark. A volitional mark, if we use Scott's language. Of course, that's quickly betrayed as soon as the practitioner or researcher takes a ruler to the scale and measures where the mark is, assigning it a proportional value based on the mark's distance from the leftmost notch. This tool is meant to measure intensity of pain. As it moves from the individual as a mark on a line to the collective as a numerical value representing distance, that mark is effectively erased. Does a patient in great pain press hard with their pencil on the piece of paper? Do they place a lighter mark because the pain has sapped their strength? Do they just point, as getting their eyes to focus on the line might be too difficult given the headache they're battling? In all of these instances, the visual analog scale sanitizes the affect of the subject as soon as a value is noted by the physician, recorded by the technician, and smoothed by the data scientist. And when we consider the history of the scale, its origins as a rating tool for workers or students, who is the manager here? Is it the practitioner? Is the patient the subordinate? Where does the pain fit into this scenario? And by the way, why are we measuring patients in the same way we measured factory workers? Before the middle of the 20th century, pain research was generally done via this contraption, a dolorimeter. A drop of black ink would be placed on a subject's forehead, the beam from a bright lamp would be focused on that spot, and then the lamp was turned up. As soon as the subject yelled, the intensity of the lamp was recorded. The subject was then given the pain treatment being tested, usually an analgesic, and a new measurement was taken. After performing the test on between 3 and 10 subjects, results were recorded and published. But then this individual, Henry Beecher, who was head of anesthesiology at Mass General Hospital in Boston, went to North Africa during World War II and worked in the field hospitals. He noticed that injured soldiers coming right off the battlefield refused morphine, but later demanded something for their pain. He realized that variables such as adrenaline, pain thresholds, specific context of how and when someone was injured, all of these factors changed how someone felt pain. He came back to the US and said that these small studies with a few subjects tested once or twice were not adequate. We needed to be studying large swaths of the population, and they had to be tested over and over to get conclusive data on pain treatments. It just so happened that right after the war, as mostly German companies were looking to bring newly developed synthetic analgesics to the market, a lot of money was available for these larger scale studies. As such, they needed new tools that would more efficiently measure large subject pools. Scott, remember, was a member of the APA and had studied under Wundt, so the adoption of the GRS for psychiatric studies in the mid-1900s was no real leap. In the 1960s, when two psychiatric researchers in the UK, Bond and Pulowski, were working on a pain study, they were familiar with the VAS from their peers and decided to put the labels we know today on each end. There's a paradox, however, built into this method. Beecher argued on the one hand that pain was subjective and individual, but that the only way we could really get a true understanding of pain was through the collective research of dozens or hundreds of people. We might better understand the Beecherian turn and its relation to the practice of essentializing by observing it through the lens of what Jeffrey Bowker and Susan Lee Starr have called, quote, the situated temporal biography of the patient. Writing in Sorting Things Out, the two used classificatory systems developed during the middle of the 20th century as case studies to argue that, while to classify is human, the resulting systems must be contextualized in the emergence of advanced information technologies. How to name things and how to store data, they write, in fact constitute much of human interaction and much of what we come to know as natural. In one case study, the pair take as a subject tuberculosis and look at how a disease classification can adjust over time, subsequently implicating the individual body, one that is going through its own biographical and physiological historical development, and as it develops, tuberculosis changes. As Beecher's groundbreaking work became generally accepted pain science, his research initiated biographical changes in the patient's experience with pain. By acknowledging that, as Jeffrey Bowker and Susan Lee Starr put it, classificatory changes initiate biographical motion, we recognize how the use of a graphic scale on a patient or subject has a recursive effect. That is, results from one study are cited by another and have material consequences on how a scale is designed, which in turn changes how evaluators understand their subject's pain and so forth. This recursive process, wherein the design and use of a tool initiate classificatory changes, doesn't just happen, say, from one medical use to another with these pain scales. Sometimes the use of a design in a completely different field might be observed influencing the design of a tool in another. Specifically, I want to talk here about the body map. You have probably been handed this at a doctor's office and asked to mark an X or something similar on the areas where you're feeling the pain which you've come to discuss or for which you're receiving treatment. This version here of the diagram didn't really proliferate until the middle of the 20th century. Before then, you can find depictions of pain location, usually marked by the physician or researcher, on an aesthetically varied collection of models. This 1894 work includes 61 black and white figures, the majority of which are two-dimensional illustrations of a patient in front and side view. In 1895, Thomas Monro published photos of a sailor who had been experiencing chest pain, wherein Monro indicated the location of pain by actually drawing on and then photographing his subject. And this one's kind of fascinating because Monro saw the patient at the doctor's at the hospital and actually followed him home and said, "Can I please take a picture of you?" Some say that maybe it's the tattoo that sort of created a novelty about him, but there's something about the way that he marked up his body as if to sort of indicate again, like, more than just location, but specificity on this individualized body. And here's a collection of images from Glentworth Reeve Butler's 1904 The Diagnostics of Internal Medicine. Notice how he forgoes any scientific aesthetic in the name of a quote-unquote accurate representation of the patient. All of these examples stand in contrast to the generalized body diagram we get today. The graphic pain map with which most patients will be familiar today, originally drawn by Harold Palmer in 1949, is comprised of two hand-drawn silhouettes of a human figure. Viewed from the front and back, in both, the figure is holding their arms at their sides, palms forward, thumbs out. Their feet are drawn to appear as if they are standing up on their toes, though neither their toes nor their face are straining in any way. The best word to describe the gender of the individual in the figure may be androgynous. They have no hair anywhere on their body. Their chest is indicated by two horizontal curved lines originating from just under the armpit and extending towards the sternum, though coming up just short. A nipple is drawn on each breast as a small dot, and the groin is not drawn with any discernible sex organ. The figure is slim and has excellent posture. Their legs do not bow, their face is symmetrical, and they are not without any limb or extremity. In derivative examples, some of which I'm showing here, some of the details may vary. Some omit the details of the face and the horizontal lines on the chest. Others draw lines to demarcate areas of the body, sometimes featuring numbered sections on the body for reference. There are versions with pregnant or specifically gendered bodies, but no matter the version, the figure in the drawing is affectless. Their facial features, if they exist, represent a blank stare. Further, they are, for the most part, flat. That is, two-dimensional. Harold Palmer notes in his article from 1949 that the diagrams are vivid, easily memorized, and readily filled, and that they allow him to isolate those subjects whose pain is due to a quote-unquote nervous disorder. These patients, he argues, mark their pain symmetrically. He writes, sometimes depicted with almost artistic fidelity. The idea that the body can be classified and generalized through scientific claim is not a new one. The aesthetic motifs present in the diagrams covered in this section of my presentation, however, emerged alongside a designerly conceptualization of the ways that the quantified and measured body can and should be drawn. Specifically here, I'm talking about Henry Dreyfuss and Associates' The Measure of Man, a compendium of anthropometric diagrams that was eventually renamed The Measure of Man and Woman and then rolled into the Human Scale Manual by the 1970s. There are a number of paths of critique available when looking at these works, but the one I want to focus on is the use of what I call the language of drafting. That is, the systems of lines, arrows, shading, text, and so forth that is implemented in projects like this, and which is codified across over 400 pages of various specifications depending on what part of the world you're working in. You can see it quite clearly in this 1956 diagram done by Dreyfuss's firm, wherein the drafters use this system of aesthetic components to represent the body. Again, these arrows, the markup of the way the letters are drawn, the typefaces. They even utilize the same sort of template that they might use for a wheel or a seat, complete with the title block in the bottom right and demarcated borders. Elsewhere, I've argued that there's a sort of chimeric nature to these standards that acts as a sort of barrier to entry. And so my argument is that the aesthetic itself becomes representative of the credentializing associated with its use. In the same way, the physician is the expert here, not the person in pain, not the person whose specific interactions with the diagram are ridiculed to the point where symmetry or neatness are indications of the patient's state of mind, according to Palmer. By placing his body outline next to the work of Henry Dreyfuss and Associates, we see how Palmer's diagrams, which are still cited today in papers, how they're representative of a post-war anthropometrics driven by engineering and drafting visual standards. What does it mean, I ask, for the body to be represented in the same way as a hubcap or a desk chair? How does it jettison the non-normative body? The diagram was and is still used in clinical settings to literally test the subject. If they make symmetrical or orderly marks on their pain diagram, the pain must be psychological, not physical. Just as the language of drafting is used to reify the engineer or designer's expertise as arbiter of what the world should look like, so is the body diagram used to reinforce the examiner's expertise, or, more poignantly, the patient's subordination to the expert. These bodies that make up the pain map are clean, simple, modernist depictions of subjects who may be writhing, limping, or perhaps hardly bothered, but are always significantly more complex than the drawing they are being asked to mark, a drawing that has direct and material implications on how the in-pain subject is considered by the examiner. If the subject marks their perfectly symmetrical body diagram in a similarly organized manner, then their pain is to be considered purely psychological or even hysterical. One paper's authors demarcate the body with drafting-like arrows, eventually using arbitrarily sized discrete units to track and compare pain across bodies that may have, in actuality, significant physical variations. The variation between actual bodies is something Palmer calls out when he laments the uncertainty of interpreting facial markings due to the quote-unquote organic possibilities involved. And yet the standard hairless and normally proportioned head persists across diagrams still today. All of this occurs in the service of reifying the expertise held by those administering the examination. However, whereas early examples of the pain diagram were imbued with expertise via the heavily individualized or realistic representation of the human figure, the Palmer technique typifies a distrust in the patient, a standard through which an examiner tests the patient. By studying body diagrams for pain care, we can highlight how embracing similar aesthetic choices as those drawing the schematics and blueprints of industry, architecture, and design, researchers embracing the Palmer diagrams frame the body as another object that can be adjusted to the whim of the examiner. And in this final case study, I'm going to focus on the examiner, one under a specific kind of pressure to be a specific kind of caretaker, resulting, I argue, in a specific kind of scale. Usually this is the scale that most of my audiences recognize. It's the Wong-Baker Faces scale, and it was researched, developed, and designed by two nurses working in the late 1980s in a pediatric burn unit at Hillcrest Medical Center in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Connie Baker and Donna Wong used stickers as rewards when working with children and noticed that many came with facial expressions. Baker eventually began asking patients and subjects to fill in blank circles with illustrations representative of how they felt. Composites of the drawings were made for further testing before a professional illustrator was hired to produce the final product. The Wong-Baker Faces scale came to prevalence around the same time that these similarly designed scales did. Note the use of the face accompanied by a number. Some are photographic, some are illustrated, some are drawn with a great deal of detail, some highly abstracted. Now, that's something I go into in more detail in my dissertation work, but the important thing to know here is that all of the research that accompanies the introduction of these scales cites the same paper, a 1974 master's thesis in nursing by a student named Joe Eland. In her work, Eland argues that pediatric nurses are specifically in need of a scale like these because of their place at the front lines of patient evaluation and treatment. That is, once you're in the hospital, which I'm assuming many of you have been, pay close attention. Doctors will give guidance on how to treat pain, but nurses are the literal key holders to the meds. I remember when my wife had our son, each nurse had a special key that would open a locked box hanging from the IV pole. Remember, these scales came to be in the mid 1980s. Second wave feminism is transitioning out. Reagan era market deregulations are moving in as thousands are being purged from the Medicare rolls, and HMOs are taking over while hospital commercialization and consolidation is taking place. The pressure that nurses are under is immense. They're being told not to be subordinate to doctors. They're being told to treat patients quickly and, more importantly, tie treatment to diagnoses for the sake of insurance bills. So these nurses, Wong, Baker, and the like, they took matters into their own hands, literally, and, having all read Joe Eland's thesis arguing for face-based scales, started drawing exactly that. And now, the Wong-Baker FACES scale is one of the most widely used tools in pain diagnosis and treatment. Eland cites the influence of the Children's Apperception Test, drawing a line from projective techniques in pediatric psychology, wherein children are asked to identify with and provide narratives to various cartoonish scenes, through to the ways that the affective force of pain might be visible on sparsely drawn faces. Eventually, I argue that the projective techniques and cartoon drawings were chosen just as the bare visual analog scale line and the simple body diagram outline for their universalizing properties. This is especially salient when contextualizing the role of the nurse at the end of second wave feminism and beginning of neoliberal austerity. Focusing on the images themselves, I also argue that we might understand their possible effect on our overall cultural understanding of pain through the ugly laws that govern the disappearance, incarceration, and institutionalization of the disabled body throughout the West's history. It's important here to think back to Beecher and his large N studies. Now, I'm not here to suggest that I think it's valid to put an analgesic on the market when only a handful of subjects have been tested under rather specious conditions. I am, however, arguing that perhaps a drive towards efficiency is inherently damaging to the subject in pain. This is, of course, not revolutionary. So again, I won't belabor this point. Rather, I want to look at one small example of where this obsession with an efficient and true measurement of pain is going, and then I want to turn quickly to where I'm started taking my research at this point. This is the website for PainQX, a startup that since the mid-2010s has been raising money and building a product that purports to be an AI-powered medical device embodying a next-generation approach to objectively measure chronic pain in humans. Here is a slide from a 2017 presentation that they gave to prospective collaborators and investors. In short, they propose putting an EEG on a patient's head, reading brain waves, comparing those waves to previously studied subjects in pain, and then sending the doctor a patient's objective pain score. Also note the dollar signs on the cloud, so they do plan on making money, though that is entirely unclear how. The idea is that they'll use a cache of brain recordings from subjects who claim to be in pain, and then compare those recordings to your recordings, and voila, objective pain. The company claims to have over 600 EEG recordings, this is from a few years ago, from 3 devices. Now, okay, 600 sounds pretty small, absurdly small, but saying that the data isn't all-encompassing is not the right argument to make, because the counter to this data collection system doesn't collect enough data is then, okay, we'll go and collect more data. This is akin to those who think facial recognition of tech will become more equitable when non-white faces are more easily recognized by tech that is then implemented in systems of surveillance and policing. And here I'm using Ruha Benjamin and Chris Gilliard to understand this sort of danger. And doing this work and talking about it over the past half-decade has made it clear to me that many of us in the community consider these tools, maybe not the PainQX one, but the first 3, to be necessary evils. We understand that they can act as barriers rather than aids, but what is to be done about that? Recently, I've received a small SSHRC Explore grant to pilot some focus groups of patients and practitioners to show them the scales, talk a bit about their respective lineages, and ask them to talk about their experiences in the context of those scales lineages. My recruitment efforts have gone better than I hoped, so I'm currently on hold adding research subjects, but I am hoping the ILC can help me in that regard in the near future. The ultimate goal of this entire project is to help those of us who encounter these scales regularly understand that these tools did not just appear out of nowhere, that they are designed with certain biases and powers built into them, and that maybe one day we can collectively argue for more appropriate means of pain evaluation. Thanks very much, and I'm open to your questions, and please feel free to reach out.